Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King. Darren, it's always good to get back together and to face the next show. You never know where we're going to go sometimes with the content of the show, and I'm looking forward to this one in particular because there's some very interesting avenues to explore, some of which are apparent and some of which will reveal themselves during our conversation. And that's always kind of the fun part for me. Before we kind of dive into that stuff, I always like checking in with you to know how you're doing, how you're feeling. It's important to me as reflecting on this today that this is kind of a practice that we've implemented on the show, really this check-in. And I found that to be really valuable. It's very personal. We don't always do that kind of thing in our day-to-day interactions with other individuals. Sometimes you just jump right into work or whatnot, but really doing that check-in, how you're feeling, how are you doing? I think that's a great way to start this very human interaction. So Darren, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm pretty profoundly impacted by things that have been happening recently. I've made some comments on social media about that, just in terms of a synchronicity storm that I experienced a couple of Fridays ago, and I know we're going to get into that later today. Even after that stopped, I had continuing things that were happening that were anomalous and seemed really significant, and synchronistically so. So I remember when we were having conversations maybe a year ago, and I was talking about how things were winding up and getting more and more strange, and wondering where it was all going, and seemingly thinking it couldn't go much more strange than it was already. And I kind of hit a new normal at some point, but then over the last few weeks, I would say things have kicked up into another gear again. It feels kind of like another arm of a spiral at a higher level now, where I'm able to see the things I saw before, but now I see with more context and with more perspective than I did before. And it's really profound, and it makes me look at this life as one slice of a much larger puzzle. And it really makes me think about everything that's happening so differently too. So it's been helpful for me personally, because in the midst of some pretty overwhelming circumstances in the world arising right now, it helps me to see that band of the tornado from outside the tornado, and helps me understand how different currents in a much larger context are causing some of the tornado, but it's not the sum total of everything that's going on. And there's a greater sort of symmetry beyond that I can see with perspective, and it helps me understand how to behave within the arm of the tornado kind of thing. So it's probably a strange way to do a check-in, but that's really what has been my life recently. I'm both really struck by the import of this time, just in terms of human history, as well as my own history, but also really excited about joining forces with people who really want to become the change we seek in the world, and looking forward to ways that will manifest later this year. So a mix of many things going on, but it's certainly profound.
As your friend, it's really great to hear that and to know how passionate you are about the subject. Sometimes I feel, many times I feel that I'm along for the ride, and it's really exciting for me to be a witness to the kinds of change that you're going through. You are fully immersed, very much so, in this topic day in and day out. I've got, as you know, a lot of different obligations in my life sort of swirling around. I have my own little tornadoes, I guess you could say, swirling around all the time. And I'm glad you used the analogy of a tornado, because they are quite terrifying. And certainly we've heard about them recently in the news. There's a lot of tornado activity. They can be incredibly devastating, and they are sort of the manifestation of all of this energetic movement that's happening in our atmosphere. And you don't want to be in their path. At the same time, it's just something that has to occur. Given the inputs into the system, these are some of the natural outflows. And if you'd never experienced one or even heard of one, it would be absolutely, cataclysmic. And sometimes it even feels that way. But when you understand what they are and you've had time to study them, you know that they are just another natural phenomena, as terrifying and as dangerous as they may be. And so I find it interesting you use that analogy, because that is what it feels like sometimes on these spiritual and developmental journeys. It feels as if I don't know what this is like. I don't know what I'm getting into. It feels chaotic. It feels like it could be completely destructive. And yet you come through that experience and you come to realize that it is a natural phenomena, that it is part of experience, part of life itself. So I really resonate with that example that you use, and I'm sure you're not done. I'm sure that the spirals will continue to swirl.
Yeah, that seems to be the trend. And I'll just say, too, I want to encourage people with that sense that there is a larger order. Sometimes that is hard to see when you're right in the midst of the chaos. When the tornado is coming over the horizon in your direction, it's difficult to see how that can be part of some larger movement that is sensical. But I would say it is. And I think people are going to increasingly need that perspective to make sense of things and to stay grounded as these various news items are spinning up, speaking of tornadoes, in our midst and in our awareness. We're going to feel overwhelmed in many ways, but there really is a transition underway, and it's part of a larger move, a larger system. And I would just encourage people to keep that in mind and begin those grounding practices now, begin that work now, because I think you're going to need it all the more as time rolls on here.
Undoubtedly. Well, like we often like to do as we start our show, we want to go over some of the recent events that have been going on in the world of UAPs and phenomena-related things. And one of those are several interesting items to cover. So one of those is we finally got a release date for the book from Luelando. The title is Imminent: Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs. And that book itself is to be imminently published. It's coming up in August. I think August 20th is the release date. I've already got mine pre-ordered. Very curious to see what content is inside that book. I know that he's gone through a Dobster process that he said has taken 9 months. So there'll be some interesting things, I'm sure, to glean from his experiences, as we've already learned from much of his experiences over the last several years. Darren, how much are you looking forward to that? And do you think it's going to shift the conversation? Obviously, Elizondo is a very high-profile advocate for this subject. We know he's got strong connections with folks in Congress, the UAP caucus. He's been lobbying for this subject for quite some time. Do you feel like this is going to be moving the needle? And, what is your take on the title, this imminent title that he has chosen?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I'll come to the title in a minute. But the first thing I'll say is definitely think it will move the needle, if for no other reason than because it's just one more piece that's being introduced when we're already seeing congressional pressure and whatnot to get to the bottom of this. So his book helps to give further juice to that cause. Like everyone else, really curious to see what's in the book. As we know with these kinds of situations, when it goes through the Dobster process, the people on the other end who are either approving or disapproving these different claims made in the book, beyond things that are clearly something that can't be released because it's got national security implications. But my understanding is that he did his best from the beginning to logically know what was likely not going to be passed by Dobster. So he did a lot of editing himself to make sure he wasn't doing anything like that. So then it really comes down to when they decide what they will allow, what they won't allow. You end up in this interesting game that we've heard referred to before, because if they're to say no to something, then that kind of hints that there's something to that. And so sometimes even the gatekeepers who don't want this to come out have to play this juggling game where they say, if we say no to this, then we're kind of basically implying that there's something here. If we say go ahead with this, we can hope that it sounds so outlandish that no one will take it that seriously. And in the past, that tended to work pretty well because this was a fringe topic and people didn't take it seriously. And frankly, some of the revelations are so consequential and so mind-bending that many people just don't take it seriously. But the scales are beginning to tip, right? Where more and more people are thinking there's something to this. So every time you don't block something, you add fuel to the fire. So I think we're getting to that point where, and maybe I've already passed that point, where the threshold is tipped over now, and this is a snowball that's not going to stop. That's my sense of things, and I'm really curious to see what's in the book. And I do think that it'll help, if nothing else, slot in some pieces to the puzzle. Because we think about now, what's amazing about the time that we live in is we have all these great researchers who, even beyond what Luelando is doing or what Chris Mellon's doing, are able to go, wait a second, this lines up with what George Knapp said over here or what this person said 15 years ago. So it helps to piece together a puzzle. And so you think about this whiteboard where we're connecting all these dots, we suddenly have more and more that begins to be filled in, and that helps to ground the reality all the more.
Yeah, I think it is going to move the needle. I know there are sort of detractors to Luelando as just as much as they're huge fans of his. I absolutely applaud what he has done for this cause and support his efforts. to move this conversation forward, it's going to be controversial. I have no doubt. It'll be talked about quite a bit. The title, which I know you wanted to touch on, so I want to come back to you on that. The title is, I think, in line with some of the comments he's made with the shows that he's done over the past few years, that there is this sense of urgency to getting this topic out. I think he likes to use the analogy of rotting fruit, right? You can't just leave it alone in the fridge. It's not going to smell any better. You got to deal with it. And so I think he has that perspective on this subject, that the government needs to be forthcoming with its citizens, with the world, what it knows, that we have a right to this information. And we certainly have heard that echoed by other recent whistleblowers as well, and advocates as well, that we have a right to understanding the nature of the reality that we find ourselves in, to the extent that we know what that is, to the extent the government may know what that is. So there are a lot of different things that could be associated with the term imminent. Darren, what are your takes on that topic?
Yeah, it's a very compelling title, and to some degree, even outside the UFO topic, speaks to the moment that the world is in many ways, right? It feels like we are in consequential times, and as you and I were talking about privately, you can sort of pick your topic. There's multiple topics that seem to be coming to a crescendo point that have civilization-shaking implications. So everything feels imminent in some ways. The very times we live in feel imminent, that we are seemingly going through some sort of transition, some sort of metamorphosis into a new frame of reality is what it feels like. But my guess is he's not referring to that, even though that does apply there. I think his sense is that this is about to finally come to fruition. Speaking of rotten fruit, we're talking about things that maybe there can be some new growth and some new buds that arise when the public finally can reckon with this, right? I think that's what that kind of speaks to, is that this turning point in human history is upon us. And to your point, many of these different former government people, Tim Gallaudet, Carl Nell, also saying similar things. This is the kind of thing that it is not right for any government to deny the nature of reality from its citizens, which is what this really comes down to. That's how consequential it is. So I think that's what this is referred to, not just to acknowledging that there's some strange craft in our skies that maybe came from Alpha Centauri, but that everything about our understanding about everything is about to change, and imminently so.
Yes, you mentioned a couple of folks I also wanted to touch on who've been very vocal recently. And of course, we mentioned on the last show about Carl Nell and his speech talk that he was going to be giving at the SALT conference, which he did give. It wasn't particularly long. We didn't expect it to be very long, but I found it to be very interesting and revealing for him to be on that platform, speaking in front of the kinds of individuals he's speaking to, people who have a lot of money to invest and are curious about the world and understanding movements that are happening in the world where they can then move capital to affect change. He was essentially kind of a keynote speaker at the end of the day, and I thought the host did a really good job interviewing him. He was specifically asked, sort of, how sure are you that this is, we're interacting with non-human intelligence? Is 100% sure, zero doubt that is happening. He was asked about the evidence that he has seen, and his response to this evidence comment has received a bit of controversial response in the community because of some of the figures that he cited, like Haim Eshed from the Israeli space program, and some of the other comments. I forget the gentleman's first name, but Hellier from the Canadian government and his comments about this. But my take on those individuals, and first of all, understand the audience that he is speaking to. He's not speaking to a UFO enthusiast group of individuals, people who are really well steeped in the lore and the history. He's speaking to people who have really kind of a very cursory understanding of the subject. And the aim of that list of individuals that he provided, in my opinion, was to provide a consistent list of credentialed people who have said something very similar. And he basically said that exact same thing. He said, here are some folks who've held very high positions in their different respective governments who have been saying the same kinds of things. If you just look at that from an analyst perspective, you can come away with sort of a degree of confidence that there is something to this. That's the way that I took his example. I would absolutely love him to provide more detail than that, just like everybody else. I would like for him to say, in fact, I've got this manila folder here, or I've got this, electronic file that I'm ready to share with everybody that is the evidence that you're all looking for. We want that, and I do hope that we're going to get that eventually. But again, I took this as he's got a platform, he's got a certain period of time, he's going to use figures and names and kind of use those with the biggest punch that he can. And I thought it was very well delivered, and I think really did move it forward. More people seemingly are interested as a result of that appearance. But what was your take on his talk there at SALT?
Yeah, I spoke about it in the live Q&A that I did with Patreon members a couple of days ago, because I think it was a really consequential talk, and I think it's one of those moments we will look back historically and say that was a key turning point. By the way, I think the name you're looking for is Paul Hellyer, the Canadian person who was involved in government and had said some pretty out there things, right? He spoke about specifics around different kinds of ET races that were involved. That was one of the questions in the live Q&A, was when Carl Nell referenced Paul Hellyer, was he doing so as basically a blank check endorsement of everything Paul Hellyer had said? Therefore, do we know that these races are real and such and such? And what I said was, I think it's more that he's, to your point, bringing in different officials from different governments as well as different agencies who are saying similar things. And you start adding up the odds that they would all be making it up or all part of some mass delusion or some psyop that was crossing national governments, whatnot. It seems less and less likely, and you sort of just do the logical check and realize this is seemingly referencing something real. Now, to your point about the fact that he didn't provide a lot of details or corroborating evidence, he basically just made these bold statements and then dropped the mic, so to speak, and it was, like you say, it was not that long of an interview. But the way I look at that is that in some ways, I think he sees his role, as well as people like Tim Gallaudet, as beginning controlled disclosure. This was an example of controlled disclosure. It wasn't just talking about we need to get ready for it. This was an example of it. It's already rolling out. And that's why it's so important who he was speaking to, because he wasn't speaking to a ufology conference or an X space. He was speaking to this investment group, this investment forum in New York City. And when you think about the nature of our economy and the markets and whatnot, they are the shock absorbers for our economy in many ways, right? And so when you know that there's going to be some bumpy roads ahead, you want to make sure you do some prep work to be prepared for that. And in this case, the suspension that he's paying attention to is the shock absorption of the people involved in the markets directly. So by seeding this into their awareness, even if he doesn't provide corroborating details, he's increasing the chance that this shock absorption will work more so than it would if there was just a sudden awareness that dawned on people because of catastrophic disclosure or something. So there's these different avenues of our society that we need to go to those people and drop this in now. We need to seed it into their awareness so that when we finally confirm it in one way or another, we don't have to deal with the sudden shock and all of the negative consequences that would arise because of that. So whereas some people might go, well, he didn't say much new, he just basically said with certainty that this is the case, I would point out to them that that's not the goal of the talk. The talk was not to make ex-UFO enthusiasts excited because we got a few more nuggets. It's basically to say, in a non-speculative way, with as much certitude as you can imagine, not mincing words, to quote you from earlier, there is zero doubt. And you even think about how that interview was to some degree scripted ahead of time. And you can imagine that he basically had certain talking points that he wanted to make sure he got across. And I would say that one was more important than any other. He didn't want to leave any doubt in those people's minds that when they left that conference, that gathering, they could go, well, maybe he's saying they're seeing some things that are ambiguous. No, he's saying zero doubt. And he wanted to say that with such certitude that they had no choice but to begin to metabolize it. And then Tim Gallaudet, almost as if this was scripted, followed up by saying, quote, my colleague, retired Army Colonel Carl Nell, gave an exceptional interview at the recent SALT conference. His topic was UAP, formerly UFOs, and he said with 100% certainty that the world is being visited by higher-level non-human intelligence, NHI. I know he is correct with complete certainty, unquote. What do you do with that? I mean, that's two people, right? This is the Rear Admiral of the Navy, retired, coming out right afterwards and saying with as much certitude, this is the reality, people, get used to it.
Yeah, I don't know how you can take it any other way than this is real. You can see what people do who don't want to go down that path. You know, their knee-jerk reaction is essentially to say, "Oh, look at these guys. They've drunk the Kool-Aid," and there's this really alarming, growing number of well-credentialed people in our government with a lot of authority who have drunk the Kool-Aid. They seem to have bought the tall tales of Chris Mellon and Hal Puthoff, and they're all in, right? That's the narrative that you hear. I find that very difficult to believe, given the credentials of these individuals, the roles that they have held, very, very serious roles within our national security apparatus. So I think you're right. I think this is an attempt to further this controlled disclosure. I think, remember who else spoke with some financial individuals, and that was David Grush. If you think about what in our world economy reacts first to any sort of major event, it is the financial markets. And that's why the title of this speech that he gave was Black Swan, a Black Swan event, right? This is that thing.
The real Black Swan.
The real Black Swan, that's right. This is that thing that if you are in finance, you really want to see coming, but by its very nature, you never do see it coming. You never know when it's going to happen. And when it does, it really changes everything. It's a dramatic impact to the market dynamic. And, you know, markets are the lifeblood of the world. It's not something I necessarily love, but it is the way reality is at the moment. And so to, as you say, kind of create a soft landing for this shock absorption function in our civilization, absolutely. Let's go ahead and begin seeding this concept amongst individuals who can move large amounts of money and talk with individuals who move large amounts of money. So when and if this happens, it's not a complete shock, not an existential threat to the market like we would think it would be. So that's one component, right? It's certainly getting us closer. And as we get the masses further along, that's even better. Because what happens when a real Black Swan event occurs, you've got everybody with a retirement portfolio immediately calling their financial advisor and saying, hey, get me out of whatever it is. Like, you know, I don't want to be in this risky position. And then all of a sudden you've got to run on the markets that you cannot control.
Absolutely. I was saying this in the Q&A as well, because the one thing that markets abhor is unpredictability, right? People panic when there's unpredictability. They rely on stability, and they look for growth markets based on stable conditions. So he knows that. And to your point, he knows that it is such an undercurrent of our entire society. So much is built upon it, not just people's stock portfolios, but the cost of goods, the smooth running of every other aspect of the economy is built on this. And so you do need to build in some shock absorption. And again, I just want to really stress, that's why I think he was so unequivocal about the nature of this reality. There's zero doubt. He wanted them to come away so that the unpredictability was taken away fully. He then at least can have a clear conscience that he did what he needed to do. He came forward and he said, with absolute certainty, this is the case. Tim Gaudet followed it up. Again, that's got to be scripted. These people are clearly working together. I would say for a good cause, because they know from direct experience, both in their military service as well as what they've come across in intelligence circles. We think about Tim Gaudet, the things that he saw in the Navy, and we hear about these reports of not just craft in the sky, not just lights in the sky, but massive craft seemingly under the water, moving at remarkable speeds, things like that, right? And when we think about the fact that 2/3 of the Earth's surface is actually water, there's actually so many places these beings could hide and actually have full-on bases and things like that, especially when they have advanced technology and have this transmedian capacity in terms of how they travel. So again, yeah, when you step back, this is what I've been saying to people, just take a moment to really grok this, to really make note of this remarkable time in history. We think about our friend James Iandoli was saying to me that, 10 years ago, you might have an article here or there, and you'd sort of hope, well, they sort of didn't totally mock it, so that's good, right? Now we're seeing articles regularly, and we're seeing this happen in economic forums, again, with no mincing of words, and these are not UFO researchers or UFO enthusiasts. These are some of our most credentialed military personnel who have no reason to say these things unless they really believe it's true and they are being clear about their conscience that they want to be on the side of history that helps humanity prepare for this transition moment, which, again, speaking to Luelando's book, seems imminent.
It does indeed. Nell mentioned this as well in his talk, and I think it's worth reiterating, pointing out that we've got very senior people in Congress and the Senate from both parties who are still interested in pursuing the subject. We know that legislative efforts are still underway to push this further down the field than has been before. Obviously, there are some hurdles to get through for that language to get through, as there were with the last year. But it doesn't seem like they're letting off the gas, that they still find this to be incredibly important. That's true from Senator Rounds. Certainly, that's true from the others as well who co-sponsored that legislation in the NDAA. So, again, another clue that this is incredibly important and not going away. It's going to be part of our conversation for the rest of this year.
Yes, and as I say recently and frequently, I just, again, want to bring people's attention to the fact that in the midst of all these stressors in the world, these existential threats we feel, these extinction-level threats, what are the chances that this matter of the UFO phenomenon, of non-human intelligences, of sophisticated non-human intelligences, which seem to stretch our understanding of what reality is itself, what are the chances that just by chance that would be arising while we are facing these existential threats as a species? I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's synchronistically all connected because, again, we're reaching this penultimate moment in human history, and that also is imminent.
Mm-hmm. A crescendo. Well, a lot of great things that we covered there. I think really important to touch in on those topics and kind of get a pulse for where we are. To me, the momentum is still continuing forward. It's going to continue in that regard. I hope we'll hear from David Grush soon. I know he was scheduled to speak at SALT, so he's got something to say. He just wasn't able to say it. I hope we will hear from him soon. I suspect we will. I just don't know how soon that will be. But what are you looking forward to in terms of other news that might be coming our way before we jump into our main topic for the show?
Well, I think what I'm looking for is, when does the mainstream media grab onto this? We still are not really seeing that. There's all this information is coming up in secondary media, and you have podcasts like ours and George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell and people like Ross Coulthart who are actually carrying the torch here. At some point, to your point, when all these different Congress people that's bipartisan in nature, right, in terms of pushing for this, as well as these really respected, credentialed people from the military. We have people like Marco Rubio from the Gang of Eight who have more access to information like this than anybody else in Congress, heavily saying it seems real to me. It does not seem logical or plausible even that this many people that are high-ranking, credentialed individuals with stellar careers would be all making this up or all suffering from some mass delusion or some mass psyop. It does not seem plausible to him, and he's someone who would be in a position to know. So it's remarkable when you really think about how many different elements within our government are speaking to this, and it's not being picked up by the mainstream media. Again, it raises questions about, is that just because of the history of the stigma, or is there some attempt to try to strangle this in that one part of our society's conversation? It's not clear, but at some point it will not be possible for them to ignore it anymore, because at some point we're going to pass this threshold, and then we're really in for an interesting ride, because then it becomes something that will be the topic over every water cooler at work and over every dinner table in the family's conversation. That also seems imminent, perhaps not within weeks or months, but you don't get much beyond that before you start thinking that's going to be happening sooner than later.
Okay, well, I want to dive into our main topic for the show. You've alluded to this in a recent post on X, so I do want you to tee this one up, and that's this connection between synchronicity and high strangeness. So how do you want to set the table for this conversation?
Well, the first thing I'll say in terms of setting the table is that I feel the table is being set for me in many ways. There seems to be some arm of intelligence that is setting the table in terms of my life circumstances. And to some extent, I'm following the lead of that larger arm of consciousness, which I'm a part of, I would say. So yes, to sort of give some clarity around what you're referring to there with this X post, I had this remarkable synchronicity storm 2 Fridays ago. And you will know, of all people, as well as other people might know as well, that I've had some pretty profound experiences, but this one really took the cake and was so profound that it really does make you question the nature of reality. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that was just a mix of circumstances that seemed uncanny. It was much more than that. It was a moment of true transformation where I think I'll always look back at that day and think about it as something where my life truly changed. And as I said in the beginning, it hasn't fully let up. Like it's reached a new level, and from that new plateau now, things continue to roll out. It's interesting to sort of reflect on how much of this is what's changing in me and how much of it is because the nature of reality seems to be changing. I think it's a bit of both, actually, which is fascinating. And this speaks to synchronicity and how synchronicity is connected to high strangeness, and high strangeness is connected to the paranormal and the UFO phenomenon. Somehow this is all wrapped up together. I was reflecting on this earlier today, thinking about what is the link here. It seems like we have a default mode of moving through the world as a civilization, especially Western civilization, with a physicalist kind of understanding of reality. But something about these beings and these aspects that we encounter almost seem like keys or portals into a larger reality. And it eclipses and to some degree negates the physicalist notions. And that's what's so fascinating about it, because it's not just a one-off event or even a series of events, but it's events that unlock, decode, and open up a new chapter of understanding of a much more broad understanding of reality. That's been my experience. That's the experience of many other people too. This is something that we know is common amongst any of the people who experience one of the contact modalities, is that their worldview changes. They become different people. And even when you do longitudinal studies, decades later, they're still changed. This is a one and done. Once you've had one of these experiences, you cannot go back. So, but let's give some specifics to how synchronicity is tied into high strangeness and the paranormal and the UFO phenomenon. To give people a little bit of clarity here and some context, synchronicity is a concept that was introduced by Carl Jung and refers to the meaningful coincidence of two or more events when something other than the probability of chance is involved. It suggests that events are connected not by causality, but by meaning. High strangeness, a term often used in paranormal and UFO studies, refers to bizarre or inexplicable phenomena that defy conventional understanding. The connection between synchronicity and high strangeness in the context of the paranormal can be understood in several ways. Number one, perception of meaning. In the paranormal realm, individuals often report experiences that are highly personal and significant, though not causally connected. These experiences can feel meaningful, similar to synchronicities, because they resonate deeply with the individual's personal life or psyche. Number two, pattern recognition. Both synchronicity and high strangeness involve recognizing patterns and meanings in events that might otherwise be dismissed as random. People experiencing high strangeness may see synchronicities as part of a larger pattern of unusual occurrences, reinforcing the sense of a hidden or alternate reality. I really want to key in on that because that was the experience I had 2 Fridays ago. Number three, psychological impact. Synchronicities often have a profound psychological impact, leading individuals to question their understanding of reality. I had that experience 2 Fridays ago. Similarly, high strangeness events can challenge one's worldview and prompt a search for deeper meaning or alternative explanations. Again, we think about the contact modalities and the worldview changes. Number four, consciousness and reality. Some theories suggest that consciousness plays a role in creating or perceiving synchronicities and paranormal events. The idea is that the mind may be more attuned to certain patterns or energies, making one more likely to experience these phenomena. And again, in light of our recent episodes and many episodes we've done over this podcast over our history, the role of consciousness in general is one of the key questions here. And everything seems to be going back to that one undergirding kind of element. Number 5, interconnectedness. Both concepts hint at a deeper interconnectedness of all things. In paranormal literature, synchronicities are often seen as evidence of the interconnectedness, suggesting that the boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical, or the ordinary and the extraordinary, are more porous than commonly believed. Number 6, anomalous experiences. Paranormal researchers often find that high strangeness events come with a series of synchronicities, such as seeing the same symbols or numbers repeatedly. I'm going to speak about that too. These experiences can seem to guide the individual towards certain conclusions or actions, much like how synchronicities in Jungian psychology can guide personal growth and self-awareness. So give me some of your thoughts on those initial introductory elements to do with synchronicity and the paranormal.
I think it's fantastic. We'll have to bookmark that, come back to it, because there's a lot of great detail in there that I'm going to want to listen to again. But when you went through it, it reminded me of the conversation that you had with Bernardo Kastrup, where you both talked about this definition of synchronicity, this underlying meaning connection to these events. But I also thought about how our ancient ancestors really related to reality, and how we tend to look at their experience of reality, their narrative of reality as something, almost to be mocked and laughed at, because they just didn't understand what we understand as causality. And when you think about how they didn't have the same notions of causality that we do, and they began looking for meaning in all of the different aspects of reality. You see our ancient religious texts are just rich with mythology and connection, and the rhetoric is always calling back to these meaning layers, not these causal layers. And you think about that and you go, wait a minute, these folks had an experience of reality that perhaps was even more real than our experience of it. We tend to have this position that we've kind of gained the high ground on our ancestors through our understanding of causality, whereas when they're limited to that perspective because of their ignorance of, for example, science, or how the material world interacts and works, they're steeped in that. Well, where does a lot of our wisdom tradition come from? It comes from these periods of time. So I think, for me, just an initial reaction to that, there's no surprise or no, it doesn't shock me at all that that they would be a little bit better at understanding this deeper connection, this deeper reality, this interrelatedness of reality than we are. And so it's, like I've said on other shows and on this show, this topic has once again kind of re-enchanted these ancient texts and allowed me to view them with some fresh eyes, as well as my own experience, right? So we've all, I think, hopefully all of us have had a synchronistic experience. Some of them can be quite funny. I had a great conversation with your other co-host, Janice. We talked about that sometimes you just have to laugh at some of these synchronistic moments because they seem ridiculous, and there they are. And then other times they're incredibly profound, almost to the point where they take your breath away. You just can't understand how that would have happened. And there's room for all of that in the synchronistic experience and the ways in which it connects with high strangeness.
Yeah, indeed. And several thoughts come to mind based on what you said there. Number one, I'm thinking about how John Mack ran into exactly what you were talking about there when he would go to indigenous cultures and to shamans and ask them about the nature of their experiences. And then he would ask questions like, okay, but was it happening in kind of a metaphoric, symbolic kind of realm, or was it real in terms of as real as the table we're sitting around right now? And they would kind of smile and say, for us, there is no distinction. Again, that's a white man's kind of distinction that seems absurd to us. And I also want to bring into the picture here, again, my background with integral theory. And one of the things that Ken Wilber was so amazing about was his ability to recognize different stages of consciousness. And speaking of spirals of development, you can sometimes, if you've only reached a certain level, mistake something that actually transcends your level for something that's an earlier level. So this is known as the pre-trans fallacy. I've mentioned this a couple times on this podcast, and POC as well. And that speaks to that. Basically, you mistake a transcendent reality for one that is prior to the reality you're in. So when scientific people hear some of these notions, and even when some of the abductees that I know personally that were reporting these events in the 90s, and John was bravely going out and talking about it in these circles, people were thinking these people are engaging in magical thinking. They're sounding like these ancient cultures that don't even understand science. But a couple points there. Number one, Ken Wilber was really great about establishing what is called flatland, where basically you take the surfaces that you can measure in a lab and that you can evaluate with numbers and everything's quantitative, and you reduce everything to that. And you say, this is all that's really real. Everything else is subjective mush. And again, Bernardo Kastrup's talked about this as well. It's not as if reality is telling us that's the case. We're just kind of arbitrarily saying, we're going to count this one little slice here and say that's real and everything else is not. And we're going to also assume, we're going to make the leap in logic that everything else arises from that, is an epiphenomenon of this core element. So hence things like the notion that consciousness arises from brain function and that kind of thing. And when brains deteriorate and die, there is no consciousness. Again, that's not empirically the case. That was just a leap in logic. So what we're talking about here is actually going from magical thinking, where sure enough, people did not understand some of the scientific principles we do know now, right? And so they sometimes didn't understand that there's a reason why tornadoes form. There's various atmospheric phenomena that create the context where that forms, and it's not that some god is angry at you, and you don't need to sacrifice a virgin or something to appease the gods. But on the other side of that is what I'm talking about, this much larger context, this much larger flow, this much larger equation of which things like tornadoes and every kind of atmospheric phenomena are part of a larger move that is in consciousness, actually, and that collective consciousness across the planet and the vortex that creates is as instrumental in what ultimately causes things like tornadoes as is atmospheric phenomena. It's just about having enough context to fully see how all these things interrelate, because again, to that definition I just read, it's all about interconnectedness, that you cannot draw these distinctions or these hardline divisions. When you do so, that's always going to be to some degree arbitrary. So we're kind of returning with more information, more data, to a notion of the world that's very similar to an ancient shamanic understanding or indigenous understanding. But we're getting there the long way around. We're realizing, sure enough, we're bringing some other elements in, but we keep getting into this eclipse situation where we're seeing larger and larger context until we understand it's all connected somehow, that there is no way to ultimately distinguish. So even when we talk about these things around what causes synchronicity, even that I would point out to people is kind of falling into that same fallacy, that there's one individual agent at some level of reality that's causing it, rather than seeing there's this chain reaction across multiple levels of reality, where every level impacts every other level, and it's also interdimensional, and it also leaps across time too. So these are some things to think about, that it's a remarkable time. And again, when we think about the times we're in right now, where we're facing these existential crises, and we're in the midst of, for the first time in human history, acknowledging this larger community of beings, that happening at the same time is not coincidental. That is because somehow all of this is part of the same larger equation. And that makes a remarkable time to be alive. And I think we, again, need to see it from that context to be able to ground ourselves and to be fully present and cognizant of what's going on around us right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of people, I mean, myself certainly included, struggle with what to do with some of these synchronistic experiences. I think there's a tendency in our culture to really maybe reduce them to, I have the synchronistic experience of this song, or have the synchronistic experience of this person, and therefore that means I'm supposed to, put on the album from that band, or I'm supposed to read every book by that person. And, what you're suggesting here is it's actually more complicated than that. It's not to say that that couldn't be part of the reaction to these two moments, or these interconnected moments. But the message is perhaps more that pointing towards the reality itself, that reality is stranger than what we have boxed it in to be. And so they serve as essentially kind of signposts as well as action points for us to react to their presence. And as you pointed out before, once you begin tuning into these synchronistic moments, it's almost as if they become more abundant, that you begin to see, as you mentioned in one of your definitions, this pattern recognition begins occurring. You see these associations that are present in all these seemingly disparate aspects of reality, when in fact they are truly, in fact, connected. And that connectedness is part of the real core message, not that we are sort of these atomistic, materialistic experiences.
Absolutely true. And that's a perfect segue, because I was just about to read this quote from Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett, who has written a great book on these matters called Coincidences. And I would highly recommend it to people. It's a large book. I think it's 500 or 600 pages, but she really gets into it. And from an academic perspective, but also getting into the metaphysical implications. She says in that book, quote, "We are swimming in a sea of consciousness, and ultimately our mental life is not separable from the physical world around us, nor from the mental lives of others. Coincidences point, above all, to this fundamental interconnectedness. They allow us a glimpse of a level of order to our world that is probably too complex for us to understand, but that compels us to try, or at least to gaze in awe. Our normal everyday experience makes us believe we are separate beings, each of us isolated within the shell of our own body and mind. But coincidences show us that this is an illusion. At a deep level, we are all connected, and nothing we think or feel goes unheeded by the universe," unquote. So here she's speaking about this notion of the conscious cosmos. But you say, what do you mean that the cosmos is conscious? Well, the whole point is that everything is one thing, ultimately. And the consciousness, awareness, precedes what we consider physical matter. So, again, Bernardo Kastrup talks about this, that when scientists talk about matter, he wants to make it clear that this thing we experience as matter really just is a modulation of consciousness, the same way that a whirlpool is a modulation of water, but it's ultimately the same thing as the river, even though it can temporarily take on characteristics that make it seem distinct and independent. And he's saying that's basically the case with our consciousnesses as well, that we are all part of the same thing. They just take on certain configurations, certain modulations at different points. But when you really start thinking about the implications of everything being connected, all this woo stuff, quote unquote, begins to make complete sense, because how else would it be? If everything is connected, if everything is actually one thing, and these boundaries are porous, and we can get past some of the dumbing down that's happened to us in the physicalist era, then we begin to open ourselves up to these things. And then because there is a cooperative, relational nature to what you said earlier, then we begin to hear back as we begin to speak in to the conscious cosmos. And this is a huge part of what my experience has been, is that, 10 years ago, I wasn't doing this so much. But over time, I've done it more and more. And now it's to the point where there's this really robust conversation going on back and forth. And it manifests not just in terms of telepathic downloads and messages, but also in the events of my life themselves become the messages, become the breadcrumbs by which I make sense of how to navigate. And again, I really want to make this point that it's not just me. Like many, many people are having this experience. You and I were talking about this beforehand, that so many people are writing me and telling me about their own experiences daily. And people are writing things and saying something like, something is going on, something's changing, right? It's not just that somehow people have heard more about this and so they're waking up. There's something in the mix that also involves some of the chaos we're experiencing that is allowing for the waking up, right? So again, I really want to encourage people to have the broadest perspective they can to make sense of these things. And this reminds me of this analogy that was discussed in The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And he talked about how these two different theorists in different fields, right, one in neuroscience and the other one in quantum physics, were trying to make sense of how this works. And one of the notions in physicalism is this notion of entropy, the sense that everything kind of winds down into disorder and chaos ultimately. It's just a matter of time. But of course, and even Bernardo's made this point too, we, again, don't take into consideration how it seems that way from our perspective. But we don't have an unfiltered view on reality. We are part and parcel with reality. And we shouldn't mistake our perception of the world for the way the world fully, truly is. And this speaks to what Sharon even said there in terms of this may be too complex for us to understand, especially within this particular body mind. And of course, Donald Hoffman says the same thing, that we shouldn't assume that our perception is a pipeline into truth. It's a translated, dumbed down interface with icons to allow us to stay alive. That's what it's for, basically. And now that we have met some of our basic needs, we can begin to, through processes like meditation, through psychedelics, through holotropic breath work, these various techniques, we can begin to expand again into this larger consciousness. And one of the things that's really interesting is even with neuroscience now, we're beginning to recognize that it seems like there is a dampening down in our brain structures, and we are finding ways to get around some of those filters, that it allows people to access almost on demand these much more cosmic, broadband kind of experiences. So again, in the midst of these existential crises we're facing, we also have this remarkable opportunity where for the first time in history, we're understanding not only from a metaphysical point of view, but even in terms of developments in neuroscience, ways we could unlock this potential and fundamentally change our understanding of reality, not just as individuals, but because of the interconnected nature, begin to make decisions differently, begin to address some of our concerns, our challenges differently, because we fundamentally have this felt understanding of what it is to be connected to everything and everyone.
Yeah, the word that you used that I resonate with there was the word opportunity, because opportunities abound everywhere to notice this aspect of reality, notice reality as it may truly be. You've mentioned some practices that one can commit to maybe making them more presently available to you. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to some of the complexities of this idea. And here I'm thinking of, I think it makes sense for me to look at the world as basically a manifestation of mental activity. So if the world is chaotic, and for example, if we're going through a period of intense turmoil or climate change, it's not just, these things are necessarily just natural phenomena that are causally related, but they're manifestations of kind of an underlying conscious state of being, right? They're macroscopic movements of consciousness. But I wonder if you could kind of zoom in to some of the individual experiences. So, you and I live pretty comfortable lives in the West, and we have the time and resources, energy to devote to these pursuits, to meditate should we want to pay attention to some of these larger concepts, for the philosophical, metaphysical concepts. But there are a lot of individuals who don't have that luxury, who are living really, sort of paycheck to paycheck or just morsel to morsel. You told me before we started the show that, New Delhi recently had a heat record set of 126 degrees Fahrenheit, which I can't, and just saying it is absolutely terrifying. And this is becoming the reality for more and more individuals who just don't have the ability to escape these experiences. And so what would you say to folks that may wrestle with this concept from maybe kind of an individual ethical perspective, and how would you reframe that perspective to maybe make more sense of all of these disparate experiences and the wide variety of experiences that human beings seem to be having right now?
Well, one thing I would say is that sometimes it's an emergency that's necessary to wake us up. I have spoken before about one time living in a city where this forest fire was moving in, encroaching the entire city. And on the one hand, you think, uh-oh, bad news. Nobody wants to experience that. But then I saw everyone kick into gear and join forces, and this remarkable communal sense of connectivity arose in the city. And people were talking to complete strangers, asking how they were doing. People were smiling at each other. People were really appreciating the fire department and the police department and the role that they played. I remember I volunteered to give out vouchers for hotels to people who had lost their homes, had been burnt down around the periphery. And really, when everything went back, quote unquote, to normal, to me, it felt like we actually had lost something, because that sense of connectivity that was palpable kind of dissolved back into the usual day-to-day, going to work 40 hours a week, blah, blah, blah. So I would say that's relevant because we are facing challenges that will demand of us a new way of approaching life in general, approaching civilization. The same old will not work. What's clear is that what is staring us in the face is we've lived not in alignment with true reality, the way that the principles of reality actually work, which are based on interconnectivity. Because we've not only as individuals lived under the illusion of separation, but we've built a civilization around those principles, not just in terms of this zero-sum game and feeling like we have to deal with scarcity and fighting each other for resources, but also just in terms of our relationship with the planet, exploiting it, thinking about it like a commodity, using it, right? Things like this, treating it like inert matter. Clearly that has not worked, and the challenges we are facing right now are the consequences of that line of thinking and that line of living. Absolutely, some people have far less agency, apparently, than others in that. But what it's doing here is even those of us in the West who are comfortable, like you and I, we won't be for that much longer. With the things that are arising, everyone's going to feel the discomfort. There are threats coming online that are civilization threatening within a few decades even, if not sooner. You and I, before we went on the air, were talking about experiencers who are having visions of nuclear war sooner than later, right? And having to live with that. Wondering if that's a probable future or a certain future. So regardless of whether or not we've lived in relative security and comfort or not, those times are quickly ending. But when you think about it from the larger equation, that's the very thing that might vault us into a new way of thinking about things by necessity. And that could turn around and produce a transition to something that's much better for everyone because it would be based on the way things really, really are. I've made this joke before about when I got my first car, when I would hear it rattling or hear a sound, I would just turn up the stereo and hope, it would just go away, right? And it didn't go away, right? I usually did more damage to the car by that. That's kind of what we're doing right now. We're just watching more Netflix, streaming our phones a bit more, turning up the volumes. We don't have to listen to the cacophony of emergency that are arising in our midst. But eventually, again, that will not be possible. And in some ways, that's a grace. That's a grace because it allows us to tune into the way things really, really are and gives us the opportunity, even though it's going to be difficult in the transition, to get to that point. So ultimately, alignment and health and connectivity and a new world is on the other end of this. I think about that famous saying, what does this entail? A new world if you can handle it, if you can hold it, if you can metabolize it. That's what we are facing right now. And so that really turns things around because rather than feeling unfortunate that we're facing these emergencies, we realize that in the larger context, because this is all about movements of consciousness. And again, when you're in the midst of the arm of the tornado, it doesn't feel fun. But when you realize that tornado is forming because of atmospheric currents that are trying to drive balance and harmony in a larger system, then you realize it's ultimately for the benefit of the whole. You keep eclipsing to larger and larger wholes. So that's what I would say to people that talk about these inequalities in the world right now. Absolutely they are. But these challenges are, I would say, in the largest context, trying to drive us to a way to address those inequalities by fundamentally addressing who and what we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I, as you were talking, I was thinking about much of my Christian upbringing and these opportunities that service presents an individual for experiences of connectedness. And so when you have Jesus, for example, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We tend to look down on the poor. They don't have anything, and look at their rough condition, and their lot in life is so awful. But that's an invitation for connection with those of us who need connection just as much as they do. We're the ones who can offer. At least that's the way we think about it. But they are also offering as well that invitation to see that connection that we share, whereas they are us, we are them. And so I agree. I think that these are monumental moments in time that are confronting all of us in very profound ways right now. I think we're feeling it, some of us feeling it very intensely, some of us trying to ignore those feelings and hoping that they'll go away, trying to anesthetize the experience. But anyone who's tried to do that, whether that's through substance abuse or escapism, whatever, knows that that doesn't solve the core problem. That the only way to solve that problem is to lean into it, to give up yourself into the experience, to lean into that connection. And so this is that time in history where we really are, I think, challenged to do that in a way that we have maybe not done in a very long time. And unfortunately, for those of us who are extremely comfortable, trauma may be the only way to rouse us from that kind of comfortable position. I hate to say that, but it seems to be the case, at least if we look at history. Well, we've got another 30 minutes to go, and I'm dying for you to get in some more detail about the experiences that you had recently. So maybe we can turn our attention to that if you're willing to walk our listeners through the experiences that you had not many days ago.
Absolutely. I've kept people waiting, so it's time to talk about what happened. Different people sometimes in their homes have different places where they either meditate or pray, and kind of a sacred space. Mine tends to be my porch because I get to be in the temple of nature. I'm surrounded by all this green and these majestic trees. So 2 Fridays ago, I was out on my porch in the evening and meditating. And this really remarkable thing began to arise where the deeper I got into these meditative states, the weather around me seemed to be syncing with the meditative state, with the depth of the meditative state, so that one seemed to be a reflection of the other. So as I got into these deeper levels and I was having these revelations, like these visions occur to me, like spring into my awareness, it would sync with a flash of lightning to a T. So every time there would be a revelation, lightning. And I'm talking about simultaneous and not, generally kind of syncing up and kind of, you could see it that way, but literally like to a millisecond. I would have a vision and it would be when the lightning crashed, right? And then it started thundering down and raining so intensely, like more intense thunderstorm than I've experienced yet when I've been here. And then I felt like my mind was spiraling into a deeper, deeper awareness and connections were opening up and it was speeding up and speeding up. And then the lightning was also speeding up and the rain was getting harder and harder. And I remember at one point thinking, am I causing this? And am I going to like damage my car because I can't pull out of the synchronicity storm? And at Seaman itself, synchronistic, right? Because we use that term, synchronicity storm, and literally it was manifesting as a storm around me. I'm surrounded in my porch by the trees were waving and the thunder was rattling and the rain was just coming down so hard on my metal roof. It was a very overwhelming sensory experience. And then I began to have this experience where I was becoming aware of things before they happened. So I would suddenly look in a certain direction and a bug would appear. I would look in a certain direction and a car would come around a corner. I would look in a certain direction and a comet would fly through the sky or a meteorite. But it was happening a millisecond before these things happened. And then I remember asking myself, how do I know these things are happening? How do I know they're going to happen? And then it occurred to me, it's not even that. It's like I was part of a process that was a larger move of consciousness beyond me, right? So basically, it was just the process. I was an element of the process. So my awareness, my attention was part of this process. So in a weird way, it made me feel like I had less agency, but I was also connected to something. I was the vehicle of expression for a larger move of consciousness. But it was really, really profound because your experience of being you and being, again, under the illusion of separation, that I'm a bite-sized being that's disconnected from everything else, was thoroughly obliterated. I had no choice to see it that way because I was experiencing full-on interconnectivity where I was the scene. I expanded into the scene. I was the thunderstorm. My experiences of these memories and these flashes of visions were part of that process, just as much as the lightning and the thunder was. Really, really profound. And then I started having these flashes of different faces of people that I knew, and I suddenly was connecting them to knowing them outside of this incarnation and knowing them as sort of this transparent blending of different forms of consciousness. So they and I were part of a larger move of consciousness that spun out into incarnations as body minds in this incarnation. So I think about it sort of like this vortex of energy, which was spinning faster and faster. We're back to this tornado thing again. And then it spits out these elements that become these incarnations of people that take on a certain body and an identity in this world. But that we were each actually also just as much part of that larger move of consciousness. It's sort of like if you remember back in playgrounds, back in the 80s, we had these merry-go-rounds, right? And now they don't have them because they're too dangerous. And if you get people swinging really, really fast and people are trying to hang on, then they start flying off the merry-go-round, right? And it can be dangerous. It's kind of like that, like part of this vortex. And then each of us emerge from the merry-go-round as these individuals, but all connected and very much an extension of that larger context. So that fully changed my understanding. And I began to see all of my actions and the way I'm being directed as being part of what that larger vortex of energy wants to do, what that larger consciousness vortex wants to do. So then I was reflecting on this, and once the storm died down and time seemed to be sinking a bit back to more normal. So I would describe it almost like, if you're sitting in a bathtub, or if you're sitting in a pool, or you're sitting in the ocean, and, you're keeping your eyes just above the water level, and everything seems normal. Then you dip just below the water, and you're in a completely different world suddenly. Everything feels different, looks different, feels like the environment is completely different. That's what this felt like. But it also involved my experience of space-time, right, where it literally, again, expanded into the process. And the question of how I was separate and individual and distinct and an independent agent became irrelevant. It was almost like an absurd question when I was expanded into that process. But then as things began to normalize again, and the storm literally also diminished as the synchronicity storm was diminishing in terms of these visions that were flashing, right? Because I was also seeing into the future. I was seeing how what I call these long events were emerging, where events that might have happened 3 months ago or 6 years ago or 20 years ago were connected, but they actually were able to be seen as one long event that was connected by meaning again. So really it was a beginning, a middle, and an end of one event, but stretched over decades sometimes. And in that moment, it felt strange to think about them as these itty-bitty bite-sized pieces of events. It made much more sense to think about in this larger thrust. And these events made it clear to me that our usual chronological linear way of experiencing time is just one particular mode. And that these ones actually are more meaningful because they sync up, they reorder based on meaning. So it's not even that it was like 20 years ago, 6 years ago, 3 months ago. It might mix up the order. They would mix it up so the meaning became clear. And that was really, really profound. So then I got in my car and I was thinking, that was a lot. I'm going to go to McDonald's and have a chocolate shake and fries, like a large chocolate shake and fries. And I just need to debrief. So I got in my car and I was driving to McDonald's, and I was thinking, when I get to McDonald's, I'm going to call my friend Carly, who has also been part of the synchronicity storm that's arisen over the last couple of years. And back when I knew Carly in the 90s, when we first met, she drove this old school, almost like Scooby-Doo van, that kind of van, right? And it was really funny seeing her driving this van and remembering that. And as I was thinking about that, I went around the corner and I saw that van in the opposite lane, right? The exact same van. And I'm thinking, that's really, really strange. What are the chances of that? I haven't seen that van in ages. And then I got to McDonald's and I called Carly and I said, you got to know what just happened. It was really, really crazy. And as I'm talking to her, I was remembering a conversation we had, I think in 1998, sitting on the grass in front of this Pentecostal church. And I met her in church because she had, earlier that year, had a really profound waking vision where she saw basically the end of the world, where she saw something happening in the sky. She was walking on the street, something started happening in the sky. It was the kind of thing that everybody knew suddenly. Everybody was seeing something emerging in the sky. And people started panicking and screaming. She was completely calm. She somehow knew it was a good thing. She knew that she had a history from somewhere else where this was part of a move that was designed to happen, all part of some overarching design. So she remembers going back to her parents' farm, and in that moment, flooding started happening. So water was coming up through the surface of the farm, and she lives only a few miles from the Pacific Ocean. So water was literally coming up, and at that moment, this white horse came around the corner, and she felt like this was her ride out, right? Like this was going to be her salvation kind of thing. And in that moment, it was very difficult for her because she looked at her parents and she saw her mother descending into the waters. And she wanted to get off the horse and go and help, but she felt in that moment that that wasn't what her calling was. Her calling was to get ready for the next thing, and that everybody had their own journey, and that the people that weren't ready for the next ascending moment would get a different chance somewhere else to work through the karma that they were working through. So she felt like the right thing to do, that her mother was going to be okay in the long term, that there would be a way that that would be addressed as well. But it wasn't the same destiny as she had, and this had to do with who she was before. So she got on the horse. Anyway, that drove her to church because she wasn't at the time a Christian. She wasn't a religious person. But when she started telling people I had this crazy vision, they're like, sounds like you should go to church. So she went to church and she met me. And we had a conversation. And I remember in that conversation when she was sitting on the grass, I was looking at her and I felt this pressure in my head, almost like a headache, thinking, what is it about this person? Like somehow I feel connected to this person, like she seems familiar, even beyond this lifetime. And I've said to you before, she used to go around saying, I'm not from here. And she didn't mean she was from Seattle or something. She meant like not this world. And somehow that vision helped to remind her of that. Then as I got on the phone with her, suddenly it all clicked because I felt like I suddenly went back in time to 1998 and I had resolution of what was causing the headache at that time was a lack of understanding of the full import of the moment. And I needed to have this experience with her in 2024 to make sense of that event that happened in 1998. But at the same time, I had clarity around what we specifically spoke about in 1998 that came with real clarity to my mind that helped me understand what we were talking about in 2024. So it was kind of retrocausative and both were feeding each other. That was really, really profound too. And I want to remind people that last year when everything began to change for me and I moved away from programming, which had been my profession before that, and went full-time into this and took on my position with the John Mack Institute and everything, and then began Essence of Being. Essence of Being was inspired largely out of the conversations that Carly and I started having around transformation and radical transparency in these things. And those conversations began to be aided by these downloads I was getting about how you would teach this stuff and how the world was going to need these kinds of principles in the future. And when I would say to this overarching arm of intelligence that was communicating with me, which went back to my experiences at the Monroe Institute the year before, and even went back to 2010 with a meditative experience I had back then that I've referred to as well, and a very strange protocol that was suggested to me, I was, again, in my kind of perfectionistic mode, thinking, well, I'll just keep working on some curriculum and eventually offer some classes. And the message I got was, no, you need to do it now. The world needs you to do it now. And then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you'll become much more skillful in how you do it just by working with the energies with people. And that's completely been my experience. That even the second class I offered of Expanding Awareness was even more profound for me. I think also was a better expression of those principles than the first one because of the things I learned by working with the energy itself. I keep saying to people, these can't be conceptual, they can't be cerebral. You have to get in and work with the energies in your body and whatnot. So somehow that conversation, 1998, 2024, sitting in the McDonald's parking lot, conversations from last year, the Monroe Institute, telepathic communication with the lights we saw in the sky then, the 2010 protocol that was suggested to me in meditation was all connected somehow. Also, while I was sitting on my deck, I had this memory come to me that I hadn't thought about in decades. Well, when I was a little kid, the next door neighbors came to my parents and said, would it be okay if we took your two sons to Sunday school? So we're back in this interaction with church. So my parents said, okay, we're open-minded. They can try it, sure, if they want to. So I remember being taken to this church. And I remember the one thing I really remember is coming down these stairs and seeing this stained glass window. It was really beautiful. And I remember the light was hitting it just at that moment in such a way. And I had this profound sense of this sacred geometry and a profound sense of the deep meaning and purpose of life as whatever, a 7-year-old that really, really impacted me. And it was interesting how that stained glass is the one thing I remember from that entire event. And I'm remembering that and saying this to Carly in the parking lot about what had just happened on my porch. And I'm sitting in the McDonald's parking lot, eating fries, dipping in my chocolate shake, and across the street is a church. And just at that moment, as I'm telling her that, the interior lights of the church come on, and this entire wall is a stained glass window that's lit up, as I'm telling her about the stained glass window. And then on top of that, I had this weird experience of being aware of myself, like being a witness to myself, and feeling this memory about you came here for a purpose. There's things you're supposed to do here. Don't forget that. So it was like I was watching myself and almost like warning myself in a kind of sacred way. And just at that moment, this police cruiser came in, turned around, and turned on his lights and shone right in my eyes. So it was directly parked across in the church in front of the stained glass windows, shining this light in, which was representative of me being a witness to myself, basically. So that was basically what happened with that synchronicity storm. All these events across time, arcing across time in ways that connected meanings across time. Each of these major experiences in terms of telepathic downloads, meditative experiences, insights, all connected. The beginning of essence of being, the time we're in now, was all connected. And then continued to happen throughout the week. And I want to bring up one more piece that is really key that happened just last night. So last night I had this experience where I was again on my deck and I was reflecting on everything. Well, it's one thing I forgot to say. So on the morning after that happened on the Friday, I was sitting on my deck again and reflecting on the bizarre synchronicity storm. And then I thought about my conversation with Mike Sullivan that I had recently. And as many of you probably know, he wrote a book about owls and synchronicity and high strangeness and the paranormal. And just at that moment, I kid you not, an owl flew across right in front of my deck. And I live in the forest, but I have not seen an owl before. And it was in the daylight, too, in the morning hours of the daylight, which was strange. And I just had this moment again, like, what are the chances that, I was just thinking about owls and Mike Cleland, our conversation and synchronicity, and I see an owl for the first time fly in front of me. Then we get to yesterday. I was sitting on my deck again, and I was leaning over my deck. I was looking down at the part where all the leaves were collecting in front of my cabin, right? And leaves from last year and layers of leaves. And again, on the one hand, it looks kind of like this chaotic pattern, which is kind of pretty, but it's also just looks like a natural process. Leaves fall, they disintegrate, they go into the ground, they create soil. But in that moment, I saw this overlay of this sacred geometry over the leaves where every single leaf was landing took on this symmetrical overlay. And I saw the entire thing. I saw the lines connecting it all. And it looked like a simulation, basically. It looked like a stage set for the evolution of consciousness. So I keep saying that expression, right? And in that moment, I literally felt like this was a stage. I was seeing actually below the stage props and seeing actually the architecture of the stage, basically. And it was this overlay. And in that moment, I was completely in shock because it's kind of like the Truman Show or something where you suddenly feel like, wait a second, all of this has been scripted. This is part of some stage set for the evolution of something, which again, I would say is consciousness development. So then I got on the phone. You mentioned earlier Janice. I got on the phone with Janice later on that night. And as I often do, I walk around the forest here. It's great because there's a few lights from cabins, but other than that, it's very dark. I can see the stars really, really well. And it's very safe because there's not that many people that are in the cabins very often. So I'm able to walk around. And you remember a few months ago, I mentioned seeing that craft that came over when I was talking to Carly. This time I was talking to Janice. And as I was walking out from the cabin, telling her about this experience I had with this overlay on top of the leaves, that seemed like completely symmetrical and part of some sort of sacred geometry, I was looking up at the sky at these blinking lights of a plane, of a jet that was going over. And it was pretty high. And I was looking directly at that. And at that moment, this bright light, you might call it an orb, flew diagonally and flew right underneath the jet so that it went to exactly where I was looking. So I was looking at this jet and this bright light, this circular light, flew right underneath the jet. So I had no choice but to see it because it went to the exact point where I was looking. And then it slowed down. It was not that high. It was just above tree level. And I was talking to Janice on the phone at the time and sort of calling out the report and saying, this is strange. It's not a plane. It's moving erratically. So it's not a plane. It's not a satellite. It's way too low to be satellite. It's way too bright. It's barely above the trees. And there's no sound, so I don't think it's a drone. And then it would even lower to the point where it's like going into the trees. And through the trees, I could actually see this thing. And it went up and over the hill, paused again, and then finally went over the hill. So in that moment, again, it brought back this cascade of memories of all the things I just told you, all the connections of all these things that are somehow connected across time and sometimes are reordered in ways that make more sense where they're not in a linear chronology. And all this was like flooding into my consciousness while I was seeing this thing up in the sky. So then, I was trying to ground myself after that to have a normal conversation, but it was pretty difficult because it was such a profound event connected to what happened the previous Friday. And you come away from that just feeling like reality is not what we think it is. And it's not subtle. This was not subtle. There's nothing subtle about it, where everything seemed to be synced up and I became part of the process. I was the larger movement. And in that sense, the interconnectivity was thoroughly intimate for me and something I could not deny.
Wow. Pretty much all I had to say to that. Absolutely incredible. story that you shared, and I hope that you may want to take some time to write that down. But I can't wait to listen to that again. I can't help but think about, as we do these shows, as individuals are listening to accounts like yours, other anecdotes that we share, wherever they might be, they're driving in their car, they're doing some yard work, they're taking a bath, whatever it may be, while they're listening to the show. There are these moments that arise where I feel connected to the audience in those times, not separately, not discreetly, like as if it's a unified field. And I think that resonates with what you're saying. I've certainly had experiences, and that's one of the powerful things about synchronicity, when you have those really profound synchronicities, and that's that incredible sense of connectedness that, as you describe it, it's almost an out-of-body experience, that you're seeing the moment, that synchronistic moment, not from the vantage of the self, but from the whole. And it's almost like you are plucked out of your reality, and you're suspended above it all, and you see that there is this greater story at work, and it's incredibly moving. I think that's really the best way you can describe it, more so than this cognitive, intellectual, I know this. It's a feeling that you have. And I hate the fact that we have come to a place in our day and time where we have suppressed our feelings so much that when those feelings happen, we tend to brush them aside and not dwell in the feeling, because those feelings are powerful. And we like to think, don't get swept up in your emotions, right? How many times have we heard that kind of phrase? Don't make irrational decisions based on emotional thinking. Emotions are incredibly powerful. And for us to just kind of toss them away, it seems to be a true repression of this deeper experience that you're talking about. And so think about how many times every single day, every moment of our day, where we're doing that, whether it's where we're consciously doing that or unconsciously doing that, brushing these feelings of connectedness aside in favor of, sort of making everything a discrete causal experience. And then how that erodes us over time, like sand in the wind, and just breaks us down. So it's truly unfortunate. And, your story and other stories like it remind me that these are the sort of touch point. These are the portals by which we really can experience these deeper layers of meaning and reality. And they're always there. That's the thing. They're always there. We just have to be present to them.
So true. And touching on what you said there about emotion, in that POC episode, I talked about the notion that some of these people that have had these really profound experiences where they seem to become conduits for different kinds of reality and different kinds of beings coming into existence, was often connected to deeply emotional events for them. Often either they were crying out in desperation, or maybe in some deep worshipful state where they were just so thankful and feeling blessed by being alive and feeling connected. I mean, in that moment of feeling that connection, it creates the process by which, again, you serve as a conduit and something is birthed into the world from this larger context. And yes, to your point, in the modern world, where we have not only divided everything up and made it these individual units, and we've built societies around the sense of scarcity and zero-sum games and competing against each other, but we've also reduced emotion to what you said, basically, well, it plays a role sometimes, but that's not really how the world is run. We have economies to run. We got to grow this, increase GDP, on it goes. Very mechanistic and very out of touch with the sacred meaning of being alive. And again, I would say this being the stage set for the evolution of consciousness, and we lose all those opportunities. And as we lose the relationship with reality, it's the relationship, just like any other kind of relationship, in that sadness, it kind of retreats away from you. So one of the points that I want to bring up here is something that relates to this notion of synchronicity. This is a great quote. And it speaks to, again, the relational nature and the emotional nature to this. This is from The Holographic Universe, again, Michael Talbot's book. And he's quoting Pete here. And he says, quote, "Put another way, Pete thinks that synchronicities reveal the absence of division between the physical world and our inner psychological reality. Thus, the relative scarcity of synchronous experiences in our lives shows not only the extent to which we have fragmented ourselves from the general field of consciousness, but also the degree to which we have sealed ourselves off from the infinite and dazzling potential of the deeper orders of mind and reality. According to Pete, when we experience a synchronicity, what we are really experiencing is the human mind operating for a moment in its true order and extending throughout society and nature, moving through orders of increasing subtlety, reaching past the source of mind and matter into creativity itself." Unquote. I love that. And again, when you are in the moment or in a series of synchronicities and you're experiencing that, many people talk about them. I have talked about them as being kind of breadcrumbs, reminding you that you're on the right trail, and that as you begin paying attention and diving into and cooperating, participating in this magical journey in a deeply emotional sense, in a meaningful sense, in a purpose-driven sense, then reality begins to respond to you, and then it becomes a cooperation. It becomes a relationship, which is what the entire thing's supposed to be about, with each other, with ourselves and the planet, with the larger cosmic order, from the smallest scale right to the most macro scale.
Truly beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. This has been a really meaningful show for me. I haven't had a chance to say a lot, which is great because my voice isn't feeling all that tip-top at the moment, but I've really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and what you have shared. I hope that it's been impactful to all of you who are listening, and I hope that you feel comfortable recommending or sharing the show or responding to what this has elicited in you, what this conversation has brought forth in you. And maybe it serves as a prompt and something that encourages us to lean in rather than to withdraw, as you say, because withdrawal is isolating. We do it to ourselves. We have this opportunity to take action and to be present. And I hope that all of us do take that. So a couple of quick housekeeping note. I will soon be headed off to vacation. So we'll be taking a little bit of a break from Liminal Phrames for probably the month of June. We did something similar last year. Just as these summer schedules get quite busy, it's time to take a little bit of a pause and work on ourselves, spend time with those that we love, and just take a break, take a breather. So I'm looking forward to doing that. And of course, we'll be eager to get back in the podcast chair. So hopefully that break is good, but not too long. We look forward to reconnecting. So Darren, I know you've got a lot of things going on, maybe things that you wanted to sort of mention really quickly before we close that are coming up in your schedule.
Well, I'm excited also. In June, I will be going out to Idaho to host this retreat. So a bunch of great people from the 2 expanding awareness classes will be joining me there, and we will get a chance to relationally connect with each other and the cosmos. So I'm really looking forward to that and what will arise there in a really dynamic, relational kind of experience. And in the meantime, I'll be putting out podcasts in the weeks while you're away on vacation for the rest of the month. And I would just say finally that I'm glad you get a chance to do that. Again, sometimes we're so driven by economic factors that we don't even take the time to rest and reflect and recuperate and to tune into what are we here for and what does the next season entail. And this speaks to rites of passage, and taking some time to reflect and pause and that kind of let that feminine principle of order come into mind here is essential and often lacking in our society. And it involves things like vacations and taking a break and getting deeply reflective and appreciating those around us. So I'm glad you're getting to do that. I hope others do too, and we'll pick it up on the other side of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening, and may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.